When I opened the door and saw Matt standing in the dark hallway with a note in his hand, I had no idea this would be the beginning of the end of everything I had ever known about my family. He was so small then, with eyes full of worry, and in his hands was a piece of paper with words that took my breath away. "Mary asked me to give this to you," he said in a quiet voice. But when I read what was written, I realized I would never be the same again. Matt wasn't my son, and Todd, who had once meant so much to me, was gone as quickly as the illusions I had been living with. With each passing day, I became more and more convinced that the world I believed in was nothing but a fragile facade hiding deception, betrayal, and pain. And now, with the truth beginning to surface, I had to decide what to do with what I knew. My name is Gemma. I'm 40 years old, and by many standards, I'm probably not too young for new beginnings. But honestly, I've always believed that life has its own course, its own rules, and that it's not worth chasing after age markers. I work in an office. It's not the most exciting job, nor the most prestigious, but it's stable enough. I've gotten used to the routine: morning coffee, brief chats with colleagues, tasks that need to be completed, and then, home to my son, Matt. He's a kind, thoughtful young man who has long been my reason for living. I could not be prouder of him. He's not my biological child. Matt is the son of my niece Mary, and we've lived together for 15 years now. There's an explanation for that. When I was married to Todd, who had such a promising future, everything seemed perfect. We were both busy with our careers, yet our marriage felt strong and real. We had no living parents, no family besides each other, so in some ways, we were more connected than many other couples. I never complained about loneliness because our home always had room for warm evenings and conversations. But life had its lessons, and everything changed in an instant. The day I came home, something was off. Usually, our house greeted me with soft light, comfort, and silence. But today it was dark. Dark, like the deepest night, even though the evening had just begun. For some reason, I immediately felt something was wrong. It seemed like the house was waiting for something, or perhaps someone. I slowed my step as if there was something in this space that I needed to understand, accept, or avoid. I turned on the light. And then I saw him. Matt. He was standing in the middle of the room, small as always, with the same childlike expression on his face, but with some new, unfamiliar look in his eyes. He wasn't just silent, it was as though he, too, was a part of the shadow, of the emptiness that had filled the house. I froze, looking at him. "Welcome home, Aunt Gemma," he said, and those words sounded so calm that they sent a shiver down my spine. Where had this cold, adult tone come from? This was the same Matt who had always hugged me affectionately and said I was like a mother to him. But something in his behavior, in his presence here, right now, was unsettling. "Matt, what are you doing here? Where is Mary? Where is Todd?" I asked, feeling a slight tremor run through me. Matt didn't answer immediately. He simply handed me the piece of paper. I took it reluctantly, as if I knew that this paper would change everything. A sense of dread filled my chest, and I instantly understood that what I was about to read would not be what I expected. And so, I opened the note. "Dear Gemma, I understand you must be surprised, but Todd and I couldn't leave things as they were. We need to start a new life, and to do that, we had to take a step that you may not immediately understand. We can no longer stay together. Matt must be with you. You are the only one who can help him, who can give him a home, peace, and love. Goodbye. Mary." I read the note several times, trying to comprehend what was happening. Todd and I were connected not just by marriage, but by everything we had built together, step by step, our life. Mary. What did this mean? Why hadn't she stayed with us? And why was Matt here, with this note, and without them? A thin thread of anxiety tightened around my throat as I looked at his face. He stood there, slightly hunched, as if trying to make himself less noticeable, though I knew it was impossible. He was my nephew, but now I saw something unfamiliar in him, something unsettling. We were silent. I tried to piece everything together, to understand what had happened, but my thoughts were tangled. All I knew was that now he was here, and no one was going to explain to me why. "I can't take care of him anymore," her words echoed in my head as I stood at the door. Mary had said this softly, as if she couldn't believe what she had just said. She wasn't crying, but I could hear the tremble in her voice, filled with some invisible, unbearable pain. Matt, my Matt, the boy I had hugged and petted on the head, always making sure he had a warm home, always believing he would get better, that everything would be fine. Now her words pierced my soul. Matt was always small, she continued, underweight. We thought it was just temporary, that we could handle it. But now, after the tests, they diagnosed him with a chronic illness. His body can't fight it. They said he might not have more than 6 months. Gemma. I don't know what to do. I can't. I can't be what he needs me to be anymore. I can't save him. I stood, leaning against the wall, feeling how everything around me was turning bleak, cold, empty. The world I had always seen as a solid foundation suddenly became as unstable as quicksand. It was terrifying. It felt as though, in this room, in her words, in the overwhelming emptiness, I was starting to sink myself. But I couldn't leave her alone. Mary was my sister, and no matter how much it hurt, I knew I had to help her. She couldn't face this trial alone, and I couldn't leave her in it. She started crying, and I felt my own eyes fill with tears. I couldn't say anything. All I could do was sit beside her and hold her hand, trying to offer whatever warmth I still had left. "I'll help you," I said, trying to find the right words. "I'll take Matt. You'll be able to rest a little. I'll be here. You're not alone." Mary looked at me, her face twisted in pain and exhaustion. She nodded, as if she couldn't resist anymore. She looked defeated, and it hurt to see her that way, because I knew this was her last chance to breathe, even if just for a little while. "Do you really want to do this?" Her voice was weak, as if she didn't believe in her own words. I nodded. "Yes. I'll take him tomorrow. You'll rest. Everything will be okay, Mary. I'll take care of Matt." The next morning when I took him, Matt seemed a bit surprised, but not scared. He had always been extraordinarily smart, and despite his illness, his eyes still shone with a special light, as if there was still energy in him that didn't want to fade away. He was still the same boy I had played with in the park years ago, the one who fell asleep on my lap with a smile on his face. Matt was kind and sincere. He trusted me, and I could feel it. "Gemma, let's play." His words were full of childlike energy and joy, which made me smile. He didn't see me for what I was becoming. He didn't know how hard it had been for his mother, how hard it had been for me. He just believed we would play, and that was enough for me to understand. I couldn't let that light fade away. Over time, Matt became more attached to me. His little arms wrapped around my neck, and his laughter became the sound I longed to hear. We spent a lot of time together. He never asked questions about his illness. He was just a child learning to live, despite all the obstacles. His eyes, full of trust and endless hope, were like a source of light that didn't go out, no matter the circumstances. He was my new family, and I felt it was my responsibility to care for him, to keep him afloat despite everything happening around us. Mary, who had been hesitant at first, eventually began to rely on me more. She came to me, thanked me for my help, and said, "Thank you, Gemma. I really appreciate this. You have no idea how much this means to me." I couldn't convey all my pain to her, couldn't explain how hard it was for me to see her suffering, to see his illness. But I knew I was doing the right thing. I was there, and that was enough. It wasn't just my duty, but my love that guided me. Mary gradually began to feel relief. She felt she now had a chance to restore her strength. And I was no longer a lonely woman living in an empty house. I had found my purpose. Matt became my source of strength, and Mary, the person with whom I could share my burdens. Then, for the first time, I understood that family isn't just about blood ties. It's about those who stand by you in the hardest moments. The one who will support you without asking why. The one who will stay with you despite all the fear and pain. I felt betrayed, and seeing her so carefree, as though the world held no weight or meaning for her, left me speechless. Mary sat across from me, her face so calm, as if she felt neither pain nor shame. It was impossible to understand. How could she stay so calm, knowing her son was suffering, that her own life had fallen apart? I couldn't understand how she could simply walk away, as if nothing had happened, leaving her child, who now depended on me. Her calmness only intensified my feelings of anger and confusion. "Do you know where your mom goes?" I asked, trying not to snap into a shout. My voice was fragile, like glass that might shatter at any moment. I didn't know what to do with what was happening in my mind and heart. Matt, as always, looked at me in confusion. He was still too young to fully grasp the weight of the situation, but questions were starting to swirl anxiously in his little head. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw not only worry but also that invisible connection to his mother, which he couldn't ignore. "No, Mom doesn't like to talk about it," he replied quietly, as if he didn't believe what he was saying himself. His words echoed in my ears, and I felt my chest tighten with a heavy wave of pity. How had this happened? How could Mary have left her son without any explanation, without any farewell? I couldn't believe she left Matt without saying anything. One day she simply walked away, leaving no note, no explanations, leaving him in my house as if he were some stranger's child, not her own flesh and blood. Matt never asked why his mom had left, never cried, never demanded answers, but I knew that inside his little heart, there was a bubbling pain. A pain he couldn't yet understand, but one that was already gnawing at him from the inside. And that night, when I saw him standing in the doorway, with tear-filled eyes and a face full of fear and loneliness, I realized I couldn't abandon him. I couldn't let him become a victim of what had happened between Mary and me. That was the last time I saw her, until today. Mary disappeared as if she had never existed. And Todd, my husband, went with her. Instead of supporting me during this difficult time, he went where Mary was, leaving me alone with Matt. I couldn't believe that he had betrayed me too, that everything I had counted on in our marriage had collapsed. I was filled with distrust and anger. But as much as it hurt, I couldn't allow myself to be weak. I couldn't let Matt feel that I was abandoning him too. In his eyes, I saw the same fear that I felt inside myself. He sank to his knees, as if trying to hide from something he couldn't understand. But I looked at him, and all I could do was hold his gaze. His anxiety, his despair became my own despair. I knew I had to help him. I had to be the support that his mother had failed to provide. "Matt, your mom might not come back for a while," I said, trying to speak calmly, not foreseeing the full weight of the words coming from my lips. His eyes filled with concern, and I couldn't help but notice how much he feared hearing these words. He remained silent, unsure of how to respond. He was still too young to understand everything, but old enough to feel the pain and disappointment. I looked at him, and it hurt. It hurt not just for him, but for myself. For the emptiness I felt in my life when all the relationships I had believed in suddenly lost their meaning. I couldn't hide the truth. I couldn't tell him everything would be okay, because I didn't believe it myself. But I couldn't allow myself to show my weakness. I had to be strong for him, so he would feel that at least someone wouldn't leave. I had to be that protective shadow for him that would never disappear. I began taking Matt on light walks. First and foremost, I consulted doctors, gathering information and following all their recommendations. I couldn't let him miss his chance at a long and healthy life. That was all I thought about. Each step, each success, every move forward became vital to me. I was ready to fight for him until the very end, no matter how much energy I had to pour into it. Gradually, with each passing day, I noticed how his smile grew brighter. He was getting stronger, and I started to believe that, despite everything, he could make it. He stopped being afraid, stopped worrying so much about his health as he had before. And it was incredible. He seemed to start enjoying each evening when I put him to bed. He would tell me about his day with such enthusiasm, such excitement, that I could feel his joy filling me up. "Today I played ball, Aunt Gemma," he said, his eyes shining. "And I threw it farther than before. It's amazing. Do you see how much stronger I've become?" "Yes, Matt, I see. You're getting stronger every day," I replied, trying to hold back a smile. There was such sincere gratitude in his words that I had to fight myself not to cry. I couldn't show him how deeply he had touched my heart, but every word he said, every achievement of his filled me with such warmth that I could hardly believe how much it meant to me. "It's all thanks to you, Aunt Gemma," he continued, and I felt my heart fill with light. It was more than just gratitude. It was real love, coming from him and warming me. I often held back tears, hiding them when he didn't see. They were tears of happiness, tears from seeing how quickly he was recovering and how much I wished for the best for him. Day by day, Matt grew healthier. I saw his progress, and it was my greatest joy. Every new achievement, every small improvement in his condition became a celebration for me. I understood that, for him, I was the support, the strength, but for me, he had also become my life's purpose. I was ready to do anything I could to ensure his safety and happiness. To make every day, every moment of his life full of light and joy. 15 years passed in the blink of an eye. Matt was already a teenager, and his face had become more serious, his steps more confident. I had aged. Of course, the years had not passed without a mark, and I could feel it in my body. The wrinkles around my eyes, the gray strands in my hair, all of it spoke of time's relentless passage. But life with Matt kept me going. Every day spent with him gave my life meaning and purpose. I never remarried after Todd left. I remember how it was. It wasn't just a separation, it was a loss. A loss not only of a husband but also of a part of myself. I never understood why Todd left. Why he didn't come back. He took everything with him, love, hope, the light that once burned in our home. And Mary, who also disappeared. I was left alone, but not entirely. Because Matt was with me. What kept me going more than anything else in life was the fact that I could take care of him. Even in the darkest moments, when it seemed like I had lost everything except him, he was the one thing that gave my existence meaning. And now, as I watched him grow stronger, as he was maturing, I understood that every day, every effort had not been in vain. Matt became everything to me. He became the light of my life. And despite everything we had been through, I knew one thing, would never leave him. I would be with him until the end. Even if the world around us was falling apart, I would be there. We would go through it together. I allowed my anger to show. That endless stream of disappointment, which I had struggled to keep inside, finally broke free. But Mary just laughed at it. Her laugh was so light, so contemptuous, that I felt everything inside me tighten with rage. "Oh, come on, Gemma, aren't you happy you spent time with Matt?" she said, her words thrown at me like stones, like insults I couldn't brush off. I stood in shock, unable to believe my ears, unable to believe her audacity. How could she say that, after what she had done? After leaving her son, her own child, with a stranger? I was stunned by her words, unable to hide the disgust that filled me entirely. With every laugh of hers, with every word, it became harder to remain calm. "Oh, stop it, Gemma," Mary continued, her eyes gleaming with mockery. "It's all in the past. You didn't have such a terrible time with Matt, did you?" I forced myself to maintain composure. I knew that these two, Todd and Mary, felt no remorse for what they had done. They saw nothing wrong in it. And I could only look at them, gritting my teeth and staying silent. "And how's what's his name, doing?" Her words were like a knife to the heart. She asked about Matt as if it were just a question about some trivial detail. He, her son, her flesh and blood, meant nothing to her, like an empty space in her life. How could anyone be so cold, so ruthless? I stayed silent, not knowing what to say. Todd, standing beside her, also laughed, ignoring my feelings. He had always been like this, light-hearted, carefree, as though nothing mattered except his own freedom. I felt my blood boil with anger, but I couldn't do anything. I had to hold myself together. I had to be strong for Matt. "Don't listen to her, Matt's not dying," Todd said indifferently, and it made me feel even worse. He, as always, acted like it didn't matter at all. His words sounded as if Matt were just a drop in the ocean, his life just a small episode that could be forgotten. Matt's not dying, yes, but then why was he left in such a state? Why did I have to become his mother when his real one didn't care even a little? I looked at them both, feeling my soul fill with despair. Can they even be called human beings? Can they be considered those who deserve love, attention, care? Mary and Todd stood together, so carefree, so certain that they had done nothing wrong. And I felt like the whole world was collapsing around me, like I was sinking into this horror, but there was nowhere to go, and worse yet, there was no one to ask for advice. "Gemma, are you still alone?" Mary said it with a certain tone, as if this phrase was a kind of mockery, as though she enjoyed causing me pain. "Did you miss your chance? Don't you see that everything is perfect with Todd and me? We're still madly in love." She looked at me with such pride that I wanted to scream. Why was she so sure that her life mattered, when she had ruined others' lives, when her heartlessness had caused suffering not only for her son but also for mine? I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want them to feel victorious, to see that it affected me. That's exactly what they wanted, right? To be the best, to be the ones who control destinies, who break and then rebuild things according to their will. "I don't want to answer your questions," I said with a forced smile, but inside, everything was boiling. "I know it will just make you happy." Mary continued to look at me with that contemptuous expression I knew so well. She and Todd seemed to take pleasure in my suffering. They felt their righteousness, their impunity. "See, you're still angry about what happened?" Todd asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. He didn't understand, couldn't understand what lay behind my tears, behind my silence. He was convinced that it was all over, that I should be fine by now. But I wasn't fine. I couldn't be fine. Todd looked shocked when I continued to tell the truth. He sat across from me, his eyes wide in disbelief, his mouth open as though he couldn't grasp what I was saying. I could see his expression change, first confusion, then bewilderment, and finally something resembling betrayal. I couldn't hold back anymore. I had to say it. I had to tell him everything. Everything I had discovered, everything I had gone through, everything that lay behind this fake mask of the perfect family. When I hired the detective to investigate their relationship after they ran away, I didn't expect the results to be so shocking. I discovered that Mary had been seeing other men. Those weekends when Todd thought she was with him, she was actually spending time with someone else. Sometimes, on weekdays, she would leave Matt with me to go somewhere, on a date, which apparently meant more to her than her own son. I finally learned that Mary was not the woman she had tried to appear to be. She was a woman who enjoyed her freedom, without thinking about the consequences for those around her. Todd, who had believed all this time that he was the only one for her, couldn't hide his disbelief when I told him what his wife had really been up to. He sat there, almost motionless, as though every sentence I spoke was cutting away pieces of his reality. He couldn't believe that Mary had been leading a double life. But I knew. I had seen it. And, despite the pain it caused me to admit this, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Todd, who had always been so sure of his rightness, seemed lost in that moment, as if the ground had been pulled from under his feet. He was a man who, it seemed, always had everything under control, and now his world was collapsing. His faith in family, in his wife, in his place in this world was vanishing with every word I spoke. She was seeing other men. His voice was almost weightless, as if these words were foreign to his mind, and he was trying to comprehend them. But how could she? I looked at him, knowing that these words, though seemingly so obvious, were shocking to him. He remained silent, his face pale, his eyes searching for an answer to the question I had left hanging in the air. He couldn't understand how Mary could have done this. He was so certain of her love, her loyalty, that the very thought of her cheating seemed absurd to him. He couldn't even imagine that all these years, when he believed she was his perfect wife, she could have been someone entirely different. She was seeing them on weekdays while you were working, I continued, each word echoing in the room. She was having a great time with other men while you were busy with your work. And I stayed here, taking care of Matt, as if that were my only purpose in life. Todd said nothing. He sat there, his gaze lowered, then looked at me as if trying to process what he had just heard. But his face was as pale as that of a person who had just learned something so horrifying that his mind refused to accept it. I knew these words were killing him, and despite all the pain I was feeling, I couldn't stop. I needed him to understand, to realize that everything we had built was a lie. I watched him as his face changed. I couldn't even predict what thoughts were racing through his mind. He was still trying to figure out how he could have been so wrong, how he could have trusted a woman who so easily betrayed him. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who has just learned that their life, their relationship, everything, was based on a lie? But we spent the weekends together, Todd finally said, as though he was trying to find an explanation that could somehow make everything right again. How could she have had time to meet other men? That's impossible. I looked at him with a feeling that words couldn't describe. Matt, who was sitting beside us, didn't understand the weight of the conversation, but his little eyes reflected concern. He was staring at both of us, trying to make sense of what was going on, trying to figure out what would happen next. But I knew this wasn't his problem. He wasn't supposed to understand. I had to deal with this on my own. Todd couldn't believe that his wife, the same Mary with whom he had spent so many years, could be this kind of woman. He was stunned, as though the ground had been pulled from under his feet, as though his entire life had been built on sand. But this was the truth. No matter how much he didn't want it to be, he had to face it. I didn't have any solid evidence for what I suspected, but I didn't care. I knew that the truth always finds its way to the surface, and if I had to make it happen, I would. You can easily find out with a DNA test, I said, calmly looking at Mary and Todd, making no attempt to hide that every glance of mine was filled with determination. Mary's face went pale, and her confidence wavered, as though I had struck her hard. She swallowed and tried to regain control, but I had already noticed how nervous she had become. This woman, who had always known how to manipulate those around her, who was used to her power, had suddenly become not so invincible. I saw her shoulders tighten, her hand nervously wiping her forehead, and her eyes darting around, desperately searching for some excuse. No, there's no need for that. She's his daughter, she said, her voice sounding unsure, as if she wasn't even convinced by her own words. I didn't care about her insistence or her anxiety. I wasn't here to please her or anyone else. My job was to stand up for Matt, who had suffered because of them, because of these two. After the way they had treated him so horribly, I couldn't remain indifferent. "Whatever you two decide to do," I said calmly, knowing that my words could affect them more than any accusation, "it's your business. But remember, I raised Matt with love and care, and that will never change." Mary and Todd looked deflated. I could see their confidence crumbling, their eyes growing darker with every passing second. They understood that their world, this fragile world they had so firmly believed in, was destroyed. And all because they thought they could manipulate people without consequences. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, when I suddenly heard a familiar voice behind me. "Mom, are you ready to go?" Matt stood there, smiling at me. "Oh, sorry for making you wait." His voice was full of confidence, and it was so unexpected that I paused for a moment. Matt. My Matt. He was different now. The boy who had come to my house with frightened eyes, the little guy I had helped fight through his illness, who needed my care and love, had become a strong, self-assured young man. He stood before me, head held high, and there wasn't a trace of fear or doubt in him. He was ready to go, ready to move forward, without looking back at the dark, toxic relationships that had tried to destroy him. "Matt, it's okay," I said, holding back the tears that suddenly welled up in my throat. "Let's go." Mary and Todd stared at Matt, unable to recognize the confident young man before them. They couldn't understand how the boy they had left behind could have changed so much. And I knew that this change was not just external. It was the result of the years I had spent with him. Matt had grown, become strong, and now he was ready to stand firm in any storm. "Wait. Is this Matt?" Todd finally couldn't hold back. His voice was filled with doubt, as if he was trying to find an explanation for what had happened to his son, a son who now seemed almost like a stranger to him. His voice trembled with disbelief, and I knew he couldn't fathom how this could have happened. He couldn't believe that the boy he had left behind was now this man. Matt didn't answer. He just looked at Todd, then at Mary, and quietly said, "Let's go, Mom." "It's okay." I stepped toward the exit, and Matt followed me. We didn't look back. We left everything behind, this world of lies and betrayal, a world that now felt foreign to us. We were ready to move on, wherever life would take us. "I'm studying to be a doctor." Those words slipped from Matt's lips like thunder on a clear day. I hadn't expected him, this young, yet already so mature, guy, to be so open, so confidently declaring this in front of them. In front of the people who should have cared for him, not betrayed him. But now, in this moment, he was on top. Matt was ready to follow his own path, and I was proud of him, proud of every step he took, every decision he made. "So that other kids don't have to go through what I did," he added, and there wasn't the slightest trace of weakness in his voice. It was a declaration that he would be strong, that he would overcome everything. He wasn't a child anymore, he was a young man who could look his tormentors in the face and say, "I'll be better than you ever imagined." Todd and Mary both gasped. They hadn't expected this, and their faces immediately changed. Something like panic appeared on Mary's face, while Todd just silently stared at him, as if for the first time realizing who he was dealing with. I didn't know exactly what Mary was feeling, but one thing was clear: she could no longer argue against what had happened with Matt. He wasn't hers anymore, but she had abandoned him. And now he was something more than just her son. He had become someone who decided for himself how he would live. Matt continued, and I felt a rush of pride for him. "I had no idea you'd gone this far," he said. I saw how Mary no longer needed to insult him, call him names like she always did. He had become something more to her than just a boy she could humiliate. She probably realized this now, but it was too late. When Matt grew and became strong, her pathetic attempts to manipulate him no longer mattered. Mary turned away, ashamed. It was so obvious that I couldn't help but notice her attempt to hide her embarrassed reaction. If she had actually raised Matt, if she hadn't betrayed him, maybe he wouldn't have turned into the person he was now. He wouldn't have been so resilient, so determined. He would have been different. And there she was, standing next to Todd, feeling that desperate sense of loss because before her stood a man, one she had once promised love and care, but who had now grown into someone capable of standing up to her manipulation and lies. She opened her mouth to say something, but Todd interrupted her. He was grim and firm in his decision. This was something new I saw in him. He was no longer the man who had been overwhelmed by her emotional games. He realized that his life with Mary no longer made sense. "I want a divorce," he said, and the words came out like a verdict. "Why not? You can't be serious." Mary tried to argue, her voice full of desperation, but Todd stood still, his face stone-like. "After I found out how you neglected Matt and lied to me, I can't stay with you," he said, and there wasn't the slightest hint of doubt in his voice. This was the moment when he realized Mary wasn't the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. And even if he had tried to justify her, it was impossible. All he could do was sever this last tie, this tragic union. Mary, unable to process his words, began to panic. Her breathing became erratic, as if the air had suddenly become poisonous to her. She tried to justify herself, but her words were lost in the void, becoming increasingly meaningless and weaker with each exhale. "This is all a misunderstanding, Gemma. You twisted the truth," she tried to explain, but her voice was less and less convincing. And I saw how Mary, who had once seemed so confident to me, now gave in. This was her capitulation. She still tried to manipulate the situation, but all her attempts were in vain. "But you treated me like an ATM, and now I see the truth," I said calmly, though each word, each breath I took, felt heavier. Mary tried to deny it, but I saw her face go pale. Everything was clear. Todd's distrust was like a knife in her heart. And finally, we all understood, her games were over. Matt stood before us, not looking away, as if every word he spoke was a revelation, but there was no anger in his eyes. He wasn't the boy I had known before, with a fearful gaze and doubt in every step. He had grown, and perhaps in that moment, he became what he was meant to be, strong, determined, independent. Mary looked at him with a bewildered expression, as if she couldn't believe that the young man standing before her was her son. His confidence, his determination, all of it shattered the illusion she had long tried to maintain, pretending that she controlled everything around her. She and Todd, their bitter and chaotic relationship, their manipulations of the children, their attempts to hide the truth, all of it was starting to crumble right before their eyes. I turned to Mary, not hiding my emotions. It was hard for me, but I knew it was necessary. I was no longer going to stay silent, no longer going to let her make excuses. "You were ready to abandon him, Mary. You didn't manage, you didn't care, you didn't love. You only used him as a shadow for your own whims," I said slowly, with feeling, making sure she understood that I knew everything. "And now you want to blame me for loving him too much. You should be proud of that, not complaining." Mary, paling, opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. I saw her lips tremble, how she searched for excuses, but her gaze was empty. She couldn't hide her helplessness. The realization that she had lost not only her son but also her ability to manipulate people enveloped her like a fog. Todd, standing beside her, was even more confused. He didn't know what to do with himself. His eyes kept darting between me and Matt, and perhaps, in that moment, he realized that he truly hadn't known who he had been living with all these years. His wife, Mary, turned out to be far from the person he had thought she was. His perfect family was crumbling right before his eyes. "You can't be serious," Todd mumbled, though I could already hear the lack of confidence in his voice. "Why not?" Matt replied, not breaking his gaze. I don't want to live in lies. If this is all you're willing to offer, I don't want it anymore. Todd tried to justify his actions, as he always did, but his words didn't resonate with Matt, and I understood that perfectly. Matt saw right through them, saw how they played the family game, and was no longer willing to be part of their act. Mary screamed and grabbed Todd's arm, her face twisted in despair. But it's not like that. This is all a misunderstanding. You don't understand. I always tried for us. Todd looked at her and finally said the words I had been waiting for, but which Mary, it seemed, could not bear. I can't stay with you, Mary. After what you did to Matt, after you betrayed him, me, our family. I can't anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. I saw her face turn pale, how she tried to find a way out, but she knew there was no way left. Mary, with her bright promises and manipulations, couldn't turn the situation in her favor. Todd's words struck her, but her world had already collapsed. They both stood there, like people who had lost everything that ever mattered to them. I took a step back, and Matt, now almost an adult, turned to me. "Mom, are you ready to go?" he asked, his voice full of confidence and strength. "Of course," I replied, and my eyes filled with tears that I no longer tried to hold back. Matt and I walked through life together. We had both been through so much, but now we had a chance at a future that Mary and Todd no longer had. We left them behind. With every step we took together, we became more and more the people who could not be broken. We were no longer part of their shattered world. I looked at him, proud of how strong he had become, and smiled. "It's going to be okay, Matt. We'll manage," I said softly. Matt smiled back, and we walked into the world that was now ours, not looking back.